What I've been paying closest attention to is a new data minimization standard in Maryland. And I think it is important to distinguish Maryland, one of these new comprehensive privacy laws taking effect this year, from what has come before it, because Maryland really does represent potentially a paradigm shifting approach to consumer privacy at the state level, though I do use that term potentially deliberately. I'll first set kind of California aside, which has its own approach to data minimization and purpose specification through Section 7002 of that law's regulations, which really ties what data you collect and how you can use it to the reasonable expectations of your customers. For most other state privacy laws, they say that businesses need to determine upfront and disclose what data they collect and how they will use it. Now, some people argue that that approach in state privacy laws basically just incentivizes companies to bury any possible use case of personal data deep within privacy policies that basically no one will ever read. But on the other hand, it does seem to shut down the potential for businesses to just scoop up whatever data they want on the off chance or assumption that they may find a use case for it later. Now, the common approach of these state privacy laws also is that for collecting and using sensitive personal information, think your healthcare information, biometrics, precise geolocation data, businesses need to obtain opt-in consent in order to collect and use that data. And that opt-in consent must be freely given, specific, informed, and unambiguous. Now, that's a very high kind of European-inspired standard, though it does kind of remain to be seen how it will be interpreted and enforced in a US context. So that is kind of the current landscape, and that is where the Maryland Online Data Privacy Act comes into play. ModPUT basically implies that it doesn't really care so much about your data disclosures. It doesn't really care so much about consumer choice. In fact, Maryland implies kind of that notice and consent is dead and that people get so many pop-ups every day that they'll never really be able to make informed decisions about their data and privacy. So instead, Maryland seeks to tie what data can be collected and how it can be used to the nature of the product or service being offered. And there was a three-part data minimization standard in Maryland. First, the collection of personal data is required to be reasonably necessary to offer a product or service requested by a consumer. Second, processing, which includes collection, use, and sale of sensitive data, requires it to be strictly necessary to offer that product or service requested by the consumer. And third, the sale of sensitive data is presumptively impermissible, though there are some exceptions in the law. Now, if anyone thinks they may be regulated or they're generally interested in the Maryland Online Data Privacy Act, I encourage you to spend some time digesting these provisions. However, I would put it to you that if you want to understand Maryland's data minimization standard, you need to be able to answer my riddles 3. So I have 3 riddles in riddle 1. I've mentioned a reasonably necessary standard for processing and a strictly necessary standard for processing. However, these terms are not defined, and it will be left, at least initially, to companies to figure out what they mean. What's the difference between reasonably necessary versus strictly necessary for processing? And is using personal data for advertising or to train AI models, for example, ever necessary to offer a product or service? Riddle 2. Let's say you do decide to treat Maryland like other states and you obtain opt-in consent to process personal data for a particular activity. Does that activity then become a requested product or service under the Act? And if so, does Maryland's attempt to move us beyond the traditional notice and consent approach actually kind of collapse back into notice consent and could end up with individuals seeing far more pop-ups and privacy notices? Riddle 3. These standards have been inserted into kind of a traditional Washington Privacy Act style framework that is based on consent. And the law still provides that you can process data for a previously undisclosed activity if you later obtain consent for it. So would that actually encourage businesses to offer fewer disclosures if that standard then overrides the consent standard. So I've spoken to a lot of people about this law, and to date, no one has been able to answer all of my riddles. But I do think that many of us in this space are waiting to see how the Maryland Attorney General plans to interpret and enforce these provisions, because, as I argued at the front, they are potentially paradigm shifting in the state privacy context.